Good evening. Good evening. There we go. Hi, my name is Vivian Fisher, and I am one of the deputy chiefs here at the Central Library. And it's my pleasure to welcome each of you here this evening for this really great talk by our guest author, Robert Samuels. And so, on behalf of the Pratt Library staff, CEO, and direct and board, we welcome you here and hope to see you back for many, many more of our wonderful programs. So, this evening, our guest, Robert Samuels, is a national political enterprise reporter for the Washington Post who focuses on the intersection of politics, policy, and people. He travels the country to chronicle political discussions in the nation's capital, how political discussions in the nation's capital is affecting the lives of everyday Americans. He previously told stories about life in the district for the Post Social Issues team, and he is also the co-author of His Name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice. Samuel joined the Post in 2011 after spending nearly 5 years working at the Miami Herald. And at the Herald, he discovered politics, poverty, murder, and mayhem. That's a lot. Samuels occasionally writes essays on race for the Post and is the newsroom's self-proclaimed figure skating guru. That'd be a great question to ask him. Samuels grew up in the Bronx and is an alumnus of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, where he was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, the Daily Northwestern. His awards and honors include winner of the 2020 George Polk Award in Justice Reporting, winner of the 2020 Peabody Award, finalist for the 2019 Tony Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting, and a finalist in 2018 for the National Association of Black Journalists Award for Feature Writing. And finally, in 2013, the Livingston Award for Young Journalists for Local Reporting. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Robert Samuels.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you. This is my first solo talk. I'm usually hanging out with my co-author, Tolu Olorunipa, who is in Houston today. Tolu got great news yesterday. He just became the bureau chief for the White House at the Washington Post. It's a big job, so we're very proud of him. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I realize the sacrifice you all have made. These are really intense and unpredictable times. So it's not lost on me that you would brave an epidemic, your goings about lives, rush hour traffic, to come and talk with us about this book that Tolu and I poured our heart out into over the past 2 years. It's a journey that we've been on to learn about the life of George Floyd, but to do more than to learn about the life of George Floyd, to have a conversation with this country about itself and the residual nature of systemic racism. As a background, Tolu and I are both reporters for the Washington Post. We've known each other for about 15 years, and we both got our start at the Miami Herald. Although we like to joke that we're Black men who look younger than we are, Tolu and I are very different types of personalities. He's a bit more studious, more reserved than I am. I tend to be a little bit more of a live wire. And toward the end of the book, this came out because one of the people who knew George Floyd, he said to me, he's like, Tolu's like the samurai. And because I'm mildly competitive, I said, what does that make me? And he goes, you're the kind of guy who goes up to someone and hugs them and then punches them in the face. So that's the kind of conversation we're going to have. We have a sort of like intimate crowd, which is great. I'd love to have some questions and we can get a nice vibe going. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how this project was created. And the thinking of the approach that we took to this book. It actually started on the day George Floyd died, before George Floyd ever died. You might remember that at that point, in the morning and afternoon of May 25th, 2020, the world was talking about a racial incident that happened in Central Park in New York. Do you all remember this? There was a white woman who had her dog off a leash, and a bird watcher who was Black asked her to put the dog on the leash. She called the cops, and the world saw what happened. It was going to be the defining moment of race relations in 2020. That day of the incident, I actually got into a pretty big argument with a friend of mine from high school. He was trying to explain to me that legally, Amy Cooper, the woman, had a right to call the cops. It infuriated me, actually. I tried to explain that the law, as written, is not the arbiter of morality in the United States, especially when it comes to race and racism. I tried to tell him at the point that it was quite easy to hide behind a veil of trying to portray nuance or playing the devil's advocate while ignoring the pain, the real lived pain of people who are on the other side. And I told him that my biggest fear was that if a cop killed me later that evening, my worry was that the first questions about me would not be about my life or my dreams or what I meant to people, but the question that would govern the conversation about my death would be, what did I do to deserve my death? I stayed home that evening, but at around 8 p.m., a man living in Minneapolis named George Floyd picked up his friend, Maurice Hall, who wanted to buy a laptop at a corner store called Cup Foods. We know what happened next. The loose contours of it began to change the world. And as I saw my social media feeds change into this discussion about systemic racism, my first instinct as a reporter was actually to run away from it. I thought I knew where this was going, that there'd be some protests, some bad information that would malign George Floyd, that journalists would go to the scene and be confronted by the police officers in violent ways, which I had been a part of before and did not wish to see again. And so when they asked me to do stories about George Floyd, I actually took a plane to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I spent some time with white women who are trying to learn how to be anti-racist, who are trying to learn how to be woke. And I thought I was gonna come home and go back to reporting on the election of 2020. But then my editor called a bunch of reporters into the room. And by room, I mean my bedroom, because it was Zoom and everything was virtual. But the Washington Post had decided to hold back the standard profile of George Floyd. He wanted us to think about something to do that was bigger, that could meet the moment that was called upon us. It was Tolu who suggested that it would be great if we could follow the life of one person as they navigated different American institutions. And our editor, Steven Ginsberg, who's soft-spoken person with a good heart, but from Southern Virginia, not particularly versed in issues of race, said, I've been thinking about that, and I keep on wondering if the person to do this about is George Floyd. Now, when Stephen tells this story, he said he immediately looked at my face because I apparently have one of those faces that say everything. And he said, I'm afraid Robert's gonna think it's too gimmicky. And I said, it's not gimmicky. I think this might be the way. Because I knew a few things at that point. I knew there had been breathless stories about George Floyd, but despite all of that, I still didn't feel like I knew him. I knew he was a football player, but I didn't know why. I knew he moved to Minneapolis, but I didn't know why. We learned factoids, but we didn't learn anything about his soul. And judging from the woman that I met in Oklahoma, I knew there were a lot more questions about systemic racism, that it was a theory. What we didn't get was how it was actually continuing to play out in the lives of real people. And so we did this project with the Washington Post, but both Tolu and I felt convicted of it. We knew there was more work to be done. So we embarked on a journey to learn as much as we could about George Floyd. We met all 6 of his siblings. We ate dinner with them. We went to church with them. We talked to them almost every day as they processed the trial against the cop who murdered him. I got haircuts from George Floyd's barber. I went to tarot card readings with his girlfriend. We walked on the streets where he used to walk. We sat in the rehab sessions that he used to take as we tried to put his life together. We went to old storage closets, or storage units that his friends would have because they thought they might have letters he had written to them. We searched old closets and looked at his old Bibles, which the first time I saw it was open to the book of Proverbs. He was a religious guy. And that's not all we did. We found people who are eyewitnesses to the murder and talked to them about the day they watched him die, the moments of the present. We went back 7 generations and looked up his ancestry records and newspaper clippings, microfiche, things I never thought I'd ever have to use before, to learn about his past. We sat with the mayor of Minneapolis and the governor of Minnesota as they tried to make sense of the moment. And we spoke with police chiefs and professors and civil rights heroes and new civil rights activists to talk about how to process these things. In about 6 months, we conducted well over 400 interviews. And the last one came about a half hour before our deadline. That was President Joe Biden. So, who was George Floyd? Well, we found out that he was a gregarious man. He was a self-conscious man. He was a big guy, 6'6", 225 pounds, who was nervous that anyone would look at him and think the worst. So if he were in a room, he'd want to walk around and introduce himself to you. That's the kind of person he was. He was the type of friend you had that you look back on the old days and you laugh about them. He was comical. He was complicated. He had a drug use issue. He was also a mama's boy who was the son of sharecroppers, the great-grandson of a man who lost all his wealth in a single generation because it was stolen from him. By 2nd grade, George Floyd, even though he grew up in abject poverty, was reading and doing math on grade level. He wrote an essay about wanting to be on the Supreme Court, wanting to adjudicate justice, because he had learned about Thurgood Marshall. But by the time he got to high school, he was told to focus on something else because he was big and fast. And the people who made it out of poverty in his community played football. They didn't become justices. And so that's what the world told him to do. There was one teacher named Bertha Jenkins who once tried to encourage her students not to just chase athletic dreams. And so I'm going to read a part of the book that I think really talks about not just George Floyd's life, but some of the systemic challenges that were operating in the background. So Bertha Jenkins once told her class, "I want to read about you in the newspaper. I'll probably be old by then. But I want to read about you in the newspaper that you have made history and done something to contribute to society." Floyd listened as she spoke. Dinkins' argument, while persuasive, stood in contrast to the overwhelming message he was receiving while in high school, that the most effective way to contribute to his society was by conditioning his body rather than his brain. When he was pulled up to the varsity football squad during his freshman year, he was ecstatic, considering it to be a sign that he had a decent chance to make good on his boasts about joining the other alumni at Yates High School in the NFL one day. Just a few years earlier, they too had gotten the call to up to varsity as freshmen. More so than anything happening inside the classroom, the action on the football field had become the focal point for Yates and the surrounding community. For years, Floyd had been a spectator on Friday evenings as the Yates marching band led parades from the school to the Lions Stadium. Now, he would be among the players who led the entire neighborhood and had them rally behind him with a kind of raw pride that had been rare. He would be at center stage during the school's most dynamic moments of the week, the nights when a group of young Black boys from one of Houston's poorest neighborhoods could compete on a level playing field with their wealthier peers from across the city. And on the nights when the Yates Lions dominated their opponents, as they often did, he would soak in the adoration of thousands of fans from his community as they chanted Third Ward High. Named after a formerly enslaved minister, Jack Yates Senior High School opened in 1926 as the Houston's second school for colored children. Its 600 Black students separated by race from the city's white pupils. The 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson had given racial segregation an official stamp of approval on the grounds that public institutions that were separate but otherwise equal did not run afoul of the Constitution's 14th Amendment. Like other states, Texas enthusiastically enforced the separate part while flagrantly flouting the equality mandate. That Yates was segregated and still unequal when Floyd walked through the doors in 1989 was a testament to the enduring power of the racial hierarchy that had taken root throughout this country, most blatantly in southern states like Texas. In 1955, Texas Governor Allen Shivers, a segregationist Democrat, set up a committee to look into ways to reject forced integration. In its final report in 1956, the committee decried the Brown decision and hailed the great counterattack underway in other states. In legislatures and school boards across the South, officials had responded to Brown with several countermanding measures, including ending compulsory education, offering school vouchers, and threatening to shut down schools rather than integrate. Courts often rejected the measures, but by 1970, when Houston was the largest school district in the country that remained segregated, judges had grown tired of the delay tactics and ordered a more aggressive approach. But by then, it was too late. Yates, which was a couple of blocks away from CUNY homes, saw its population drop during the ensuing decades as it lost top students to other schools. And with few white parents willing to enroll their children in a resource-starved school in a historically Black neighborhood, it never achieved integration, remaining 100% Black when Floyd attended. Months before Floyd enrolled, Yates made national headlines when the principal stopped the school newspaper from writing about the 1989 valedictorian, a teenage mother who is pregnant with her second child. In her graduation speech, the valedictorian lamented that more than half of the students who arrived as freshmen at Yates 4 years earlier were not graduating with their class. Where did they go? she asked her fellow graduates. You and I are special. Special because we didn't give in to drugs or alcohol or peer pressure. Coach Maurice McGowan had made the decision to call Floyd and a few freshmen up to the varsity team near the end of the season. But Floyd presented a conundrum. He had good size and speed, but he lacked the kind of aggression that was key to Yates's physical brand of football. He was tall and a string bean, McGowan recalled, describing his struggle to figure out what position to assign the promising athlete. Players on opposing teams immediately noticed his height, with some shouting, "Watch out for tree branch," when he took the field. McGowan settled on tight end, where Floyd's size could be an asset. When coaches yelled at him to be more physical, Floyd would simply bow his head. His timidity on the field sometimes made for comical scenes. During one practice, Floyd had just caught a pass when a 250-pound linebacker named Oscar Smallwood bore down on him to inflict a punishing blow. But Floyd, too tall to achieve a lower center of gravity against the densely built defender, was not interested in trying to define physics. A moment before his impact, he stopped in his tracks and tossed the ball to Smallwood, essentially volunteering a turnover. If it had been anyone else, the surrender would have been seen as an act of cowardice. But it was Floyd, and he was always goofing off on the field. So the crescendo of laughter that ensued was not laden with derision. And if there was any doubt that Floyd was the initiator and not the butt of the joke, it disappeared because he was laughing as well. So that was George Floyd. That was the type of person he was. He wasn't able to fulfill his football dreams because the cruelness of how he was taught would make him unprepared for when he got to college. He could not meet the academic requirements to play college football. And so here he was, a man, dreams deferred, trying to figure out how to make his way in the world. He also had a mom who was sick and a family that he felt he needed to be the patriarch for. So he gave in to the economics of his neighborhood, which was largely drugs. And that set him on a course in his life, in a state that was unfulfilling. Because during the age where he grew up, of the crime bill, the war on drugs, the building of private prisons, we did not learn to see people with opioid misuse issues like George Floyd as people who needed to be rehabilitated, especially if they looked like George Floyd. He never stopped trying, though. And one day, he's outside of a corner store, and he sees a friend, and that friend looks great. He's gained some weight, his eyes are a little bit less jaundiced, and he starts telling him about this magical place called Minneapolis. Minneapolis, he said, offered rehab programs. He'd be able to find a job. He'd be able to provide for a family. All he had to do was get a bus ticket and move. And that's the chance that George Floyd took, going to a place more than 1,100 miles away to restart his life in a hope that he'd be seen as a fuller person and have a chance to be able to provide for his family. Now, what happens next we go into in great detail in the book. But we talk about the issues that surround the way Black people are treated, mental health, substance use health. We talk about the legal system and why it was perennially unfair to a person like George Floyd. We follow the trial in which his murderer was convicted and we talk about the legal strategies that the attorneys use to help ensure that would happen, despite all odds. And so through it all, we dealt with a lot of sadness. I'm not going to lie, there are a lot of ghosts within the pages. But I often tell people that my journey as a journalist often reifies my humanity and my belief in the good of man far more than it depletes it. This story continues that trend. In a few interviews, I've talked about learning that racism isn't something in the past. It lives and breathes. It operates as a force. And that force is insidious and pernicious. And it threatens us all, whether or not we receive the blunt of it through a police officer's knee, or we're a person who has the privilege and inherits a feeling of supremacy that's not fully deserved. But whenever I spoke with people about what they saw, when I continued to see the millions of people on the streets, despite every instance that told them they should stop, they always believed they needed to keep going. And why? A part of it was the existential crisis. If we don't keep going, we might die. But a part of it was that they still believed in the promise of America, that they still wanted to fight for a country that offered at least a chance that there might be a better tomorrow. Those are the words of the people who fill these pages. The last thing that we know George Floyd wrote to himself was a poem. He was out of a job, as 1 in 2 Black Americans who were living in Minnesota were at the time. He was working as a security guard, had contracted a case of coronavirus. He couldn't leave. He was still struggling with his substance use addiction. He says to himself, life really sucks, but life never sucks. And that's a part of the reason that when he was in his last breaths, he took those moments to let people know the thing that we often don't hear enough as people living in a tortured and terrible time. Those words were, I love you. And that love is ultimately what our book is about. So I'd love to take some questions and we can have a little conversation about everything.
If you have any questions, there's audience mics here and right here. And we'd appreciate if you use the mic. We have a virtual audience as well, so that way they can hear the question.
Hello.
The discipline that it takes to be a reporter and the deadlines that are implicit in being a reporter, where you've got to file every day, as far as I'm concerned, are completely different from the discipline that it must have taken for the two of you to spend a year researching one person, one story, one life, and all that's around it. And I'm wondering if you can now go back to daily journalism with the same kind of satisfaction that you had before.
Daily journalism's a lot easier, actually.
I'm sure.
Writing a book, particularly about this sort of intensity, you want to be able to speak to everyone until they don't feel like speaking to you anymore. And it requires having a lot of different moving parts in your head in a given story, even though my editors would argue that I should be writing more often. But in a given story, you're probably working with something that will take a reader 20 or 20 minutes to read. With this, you're constantly accruing information that's supposed to sustain for, They asked us to write a book that was 80,000 words long, and we ended up writing a book that was 150,000 words long. So, so it was a lot of work. So there's a part of daily journalism that I'm actually looking forward to, and I think everyone in my household would appreciate a more regular sleeping schedule from me. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little more about the young George Floyd, the one who wanted to be on the Supreme Court before, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but before he was his appreciation was turned from his brain to his body?
Yeah.
I'd be really interested to know more that I guess his family may have shared with you.
Absolutely. So you know those things that you do to your children that you think are small things, but it ends up becoming the defining parts of his life? Yeah. So when George Floyd was a little boy, his mother would take him to their ancestral home in North Carolina. And his aunt felt he looked like Flip Wilson. You know who Flip Wilson is?
Sure.
Yeah. I didn't know who Flip Wilson was before this. But so Flip Wilson had a character named Geraldine, who was this sort of like sassy kind of character. Yes. And so they taught him, that's right. So they taught him how to say, the devil made me do it. And what you see is more than what you're going to get. And so they'd say like, Perry, they used to call him Perry. They'd say, Perry, say these lines. And he'd do it and everyone would start laughing. And he loved that. He loved the ability of making people laugh. So he had this kind of joking nature to him that was persistent. His mom, Larcinia, he was a mama's boy, and his mom, Larcinia's Stewart, everyone called her Sissy. When she got older, people kept on calling her Miss Sissy. And she had this really gregarious, enduring spirit. She was known in the neighborhood for cooking these big meals. She was known for taking people in if she saw them sort of out of whack. She'd take them into her home and have them stay the night. And by all accounts, that's the type of person that George Floyd had wanted to be. So he learned from his mom that if he met you for the first time and he saw you again, he'd try to notice if you did something different to ingratiate you. So he'd say, if he saw you again, he'd say, oh man, that green sweater. You know, that's the type of person that he was as a young boy. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Hi.
Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Thank you for your book. Thank you for your time. My question is, we know that a lot of times the media, right, whether it's print, whether it's television or radio, it's all spun by the same narrative. And so someone in your career at your level, have you found it to where you've been channeled and coerced in a way to report through a certain viewpoint, or not being able to report, I should say, on some of the real things that go on behind the scenes, quote unquote? We see a lot of the crisis actors are hired for these racial events, right? We know that, yes, racism is something that plagues North America, right? But I don't think that's the nature of how people are. I think a lot of times racism is something that is perpetuated in the media. And so I just want to know, like, from your expertise, how free you are to really report on the goings on behind maybe what, you know, the Washington Post would want you to report on, if that makes sense.
That's a good question. I love this question. So a part of it, when we think about reporting a story, when I think about reporting a story, I'm not really guided by an editor, right? I'm guided by my own curiosity in terms of thinking about not just the incident of what's happening on the ground, but the different forces that might have led to it. what we can learn from it. That's a part of the approach that we had taken with this book. Now, it's interesting when we think about how someone learns racism, right? And sort of what crisis actors are. We talk about it in the book, that there were some crisis actors who were a part of the protests in Minneapolis. There were largely folks, white supremacists, who had disguised themselves as activists who started fires and initiated riots and knocked out windows. That was a part of the stuff that we learned about what was happening. And we also take a look at the life of Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd. And we go back and we learn about his American story and what he learned and what we can glean about how he was taught to treat the people who he was supposed to serve and protect, right? He was in a very diverse police precinct, right? And, I didn't speak with Derek Chauvin. He didn't return any of my phone calls or emails. But what we learned was that there were definite police practices that were given in the police department that were not fully conscious of the history of the place or the history of the people who they were dealing with. So when we think about trying to subdue and undo some of those stereotypes and preconceived notions, I don't come at it with a particular feeling about life. What I do is I go out into the community, I talk to as many people as I can, I speak with people who think like me, who don't think like me, and then we put together what we think is the best approximation of the truth. I hope you take the time to read the book, because within it, we go through so many discussions about the history of where some of these ideas came from and how they're carried out by people who do it intentionally or not intentionally.
Thank you.
No problem.
Good evening.
Hey.
The killing of people of color by the police have continued since George Floyd's murder. Do you have an opinion as to why the murder of George Floyd galvanized American society pretty much across many different stratas, with massive marching in the streets at a time when the COVID situation was quite extreme? And yet here we are, I guess it's 2 years we just passed,
Yeah.
and the killings continue. But the marches have stopped. At least that's my perception. Do you have an opinion why that particular murder caused that reaction and how those reactions don't seem to continue to today?
Yeah, there were a few things. So the first was the nature of the pandemic, right? The idea that everyone could be fixed on this particular instance because there wasn't a lot more to occupy them. So sports, there were no movies, there were no new TV. So people were able to focus on what was happening in a way that they hadn't before. It's also true that I think the nature of what people saw was particularly disheartening, and that the length of the video, the closeness of it in the book, the fact that there are so many videos, in the book we describe it as the view from the fishbowl and from the fish, that it was hard to look away from, because what we saw was heinous on its face and also damning in its metaphorical value, right? You saw an agent of the state suffocating a marginalized person who was begging for mercy, while he had a nonchalant look at his face, and people around him were saying, "Get off him, get off him." I think for folks who had questioned what brutality could look like in a Black community, it was a bit of a wake-up call. One of the most interesting things we see in the text was, if you were on one side of the street, there was a police car blocking the full view. But if you're on one side of the street, you saw something that forever changed your life. But if you are on the other side, and you heard those calls, I can't breathe. You saw that police presence. People on that side of the street did not register anything unusual was happening, right? And that shows you the difference between what we expect about police officers and how they behave. And so what those videos were able to do was essentially lift up the police car to make things a bit more transparent. I also think that how we saw things followed up, people really thought this was going to be the moment. And when life continued and politics continued and everyone had the chance to continue living their lives, relatively decent lives as Americans, it just did not become a priority. So I think the challenge that we hope readers wrestle with is that when you think about the racism that revealed itself in that moment, that was not the first time George Floyd saw racism in his life. That was not the culmination of everything else and every other issue and inequality in America. So I think the question then becomes, how do you maintain focus on those sorts of issues if we want to create a more just society?
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much for this book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. I have maybe two questions, if you
Go
don't
for
mind. Well, my first question is, this book, based on your reading and your presentation thus far, suggests that there's a lot of teachable moments here. And I think it would be great to see how many different aspects of our community could take this book, read it, and learn from it. So I was wondering, my first question is, for you as the author of this book, which aspects of the community do you think would be really benefit from reading this book and learning from it? Because it seems that you've done a lot of research, you and your co-author.
Yeah.
And you're to be congratulated for that, to be so thorough and thoughtful. But then where do we go with this?
Yeah.
And how can we use this as a teachable moment to really evoke good, sustainable change?
Right. I think there's a really weird battle going on in this country right now, right? And that battle is about what to do with history and what we do with our feelings when we learn about the history and all of its checkers, all of the checkers that come along with it. For me, we wrote this book because Tolu and I really believed that it was important that we do our part to do something to help, one, remind readers about the universal humanity that we all share, and the fact that when we don't pay attention to our history, the broad history, it threatens to corrupt us, right? It threatens the ideas that we can see people in their fullness and their wholeness. Throughout the course of the text, George Floyd had many dreams, but the one dream that was so consistent was he just wanted people to see him. So I think when we think about the institutions that we talk about, we look at land loss, we look at education, we look at healthcare, we look at religion and faith, we look at the legal system, we look at the prison system, we look at the lawmaking system, and how easy it is that we can reward politicians who decide, maybe not today. So I think there are lots of elements that we hope readers would be able to see, pick up on, say, let's try to do something to change it. We're journalists, we're not particularly great at policymaking, but one thing that I think everyone can do every day, right, is to think about some of the history, some of the ways that not just George Floyd, but the many other people we follow in the book try to navigate some of those forces, and ask ourselves some tough questions about whether or not we're doing enough in our own daily lives to see people as full people who are deserving of every fruit of the American opportunity. So that's what I would say to that.
Great, thank you so much. And the next question I
Yeah.
had for you is, obviously you spent a lot of time writing this book and you have a full-time job, but any other books in your future? And if so,
Oh,
what other
that's-
topics would you take on?
I can't tell you yet.
Well,
We
maybe
have
you can at
things.
least tell us about other
We have
topics that
things.
you may be of interest.
No, so
Thank you.
I can't, but yeah. Hey, how's it going?
It's going really well. Good
You
to
have
see
news.
I do have news.
Yeah.
But I can't tell either.
Yeah.
So anyway, hi everybody. So Robert and I went to college together. We've known each other a really long time, and I think we're like maybe distant cousins. But we
Yeah.
never worked that out at graduation.
I was
have
on
a-
a roots trip trying to figure it out.
Exactly. So I have a question about you, right? Because one thing, obviously, being a friend, but also reading and following the journey since this book has come out, you have like the posture of the journalist, right? It's all about the subject. It's not
Yeah.
about Robert, right?
Yeah.
And as someone who knows that you're like a star journalist and you were like a star in college, it's not surprising for me to see you now on tour and with the book. But I'm wondering what it's been like for you. And I'm wondering this from like a personal, existential, psychological perspective, but also as someone who has been writing for a long time.
Yeah.
Did you ever think that you would eventually, like your journey would eventually progress to like where you're on stage versus to always sort of being behind the words, if that makes sense? Like,
Yeah.
Or has this been a surprise to you? Because I've gotten the sense that this is kind of like surprising for you, but I could be wrong, but it's not surprising for any of us who know you.
Oh, that's really sweet. It's a little uncomfortable for me. I've always believed in the noble goal of journalism, and while I find myself to be fairly entertaining, I had always thought that the work that I could do to lift up the voices of other people was a lot more important. Now, this kind of book, right? Like, did I think one day that I'd be standing up talking about the nature of systemic racism and writing a book trying to explain how it acts and operates in real life? No, I wouldn't think so. But the times called me to do that. Like, when I thought about, playing our part, but when I thought about it, I thought about just the opportunity that, I had the credibility, and I had the access, and I had the distance that a lot of people who knew George Floyd did not have, to be able to do this at a time when people could, I'm crying, could do it at a time when they could not. And often, one of the questions that we get from people who aren't familiar with it is like, why you? And I don't know why me. I mean, when we talked about to a number of people who said, well, I want to write my own book, who had known George Floyd, say, yeah, go do it. The world needs more stories. It needs more people to give their perspective. But along the path, it just felt like I felt convicted by it. And the day that I think about most was, I had gone to church with Philonis, who is one of George Floyd's brothers, and sort of become the mouthpiece for the family. And Philonis, he breaks down at the church. And it's really hard, as a Christian, but also as a living person, to see someone in a position like that and to know by journalistic distance, you can't do anything to help. And then a little bit after that, I went to a rally because Courtney Ross, who was one of George Floyd's girlfriends, was speaking at the rally. It was the first time she was going to speak in public. And so I'm driving there with our photographer, Joshua Lott, and Courtney calls, and she's having a panic attack in the strip mall where the rally is happening. And she goes, I'm throwing up. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. And at the same time, I said to Josh, after this, we're done for the day. You know, we had an entire day of interviews, but I was like, I'm not sure if I can take it anymore. So Courtney Ross, she gets out there, and she's with all these families with names that are not in the news, but they had lost people through dubious police practices. But there were no cameras back then. They were poor. There was no social media. No one ever believed them that the police had done things. One woman, her boyfriend, had ended up disfigured in a dumpster with dog bites all over him. The police said he just jumped in a dumpster. And so we're hearing story after story, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. And as they're doing that, someone looks on their phone and they say, they've killed another one right there. And what I remember most about that moment is as they were trying to figure out what happened, that boy would eventually be named as Dante Wright, who was killed after the police had mistaken her taser for her gun. And when that happened, those people who were at the rally, they did not miss a step because they knew it was inevitable that this force would inevitably hit someone else. It would touch them, and they needed to do everything to stop it. And as a reporter, I started feeling the same way. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Do we have one more last question? One other questions? Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for this important work that you have done. Journalists are very, very important, and we need more books and more stories like this. For all of you all, we do have books out in the hallway for sale, so please get your copy, and Robert will graciously sign them for you. Thank you all for attending this evening's program. We look forward to seeing you for future programs. If you have not received your conference newsletter, you can also go online and check out our program, our upcoming programs. We have a lot of wonderful programs that will come up in the fall, so we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.